What's up guys, Zero Skater here, and I'm finally going to be bringing you guys the deck reviews for Battle of Legends Volume 2. We are getting closer and closer to that release date every day now. I believe it should be coming out later this year in December, and should have a street date at retailers next year, early Q1 of 2022. So, it's coming up soon, but I wanted to throw out these reviews for you guys, and so you could have a look at the decks and maybe get a little bit of insight into how these new fighters are going to work. So I hope you guys enjoy this one, and I think we're going to be starting off here with Bloody Mary, because I think she is highly anticipated by a lot of you, and I have had some requests on my channel to do Bloody Mary, so I'm going to start with her. I also did the Sun Wukong reveal video. If you guys missed that one, definitely go check it out. But I'm not going to be doing him again since I pretty much did a review during the reveal, so you guys can go watch that one if you'd like. But for today, we're going to go all in on Bloody Mary. And as always, guys, be sure to attack the like button if you enjoy the video, and subscribe for more Unmatched content. And with that said, let's hop right on in and check out Bloody Mary. Alright guys, so to start things off, we see the card back art for Bloody Mary here, and it's pretty dark and creepy. It's like her looking back at you through the mirror, which is really cool. And in general, the card art for Bloody Mary is definitely a lot more dark and creepy than the other art styles that we're used to seeing in Unmatched, which is really cool and very fitting for a character like Bloody Mary. So taking a look at the character card here, you're going to see Bloody Mary is a melee fighter with 16 health and 3 move, and her ability reads, at the start of your turn, if you have exactly 3 cards in hand, gain an action. So, Bloody Mary, again, she is, you say her name 3 times in the mirror, she appears. She is all about 3s in her deck, which is really cool. As you can see, the move 3, the 3 cards in hand gains you a 3rd action on your turn. So, it's all about 3s, which is super thematic and super awesome. And in practice, it's actually really fun to try and set up this ability as well. And it's incredibly powerful. You want to be aggressive, I would say, so that you can get down to 3 cards as soon as possible. And let's say you end your turn with 4 cards in hand. The opponent doesn't necessarily want to go to attack you because it knocks you down to 3 cards in hand for you to get your ability. So if you have 4 cards, it's almost like a deterrent for your opponent to even come attack you, so you don't necessarily have to stock up on a lot of defense cards because they're not going to want to go take that risk of giving you that 3rd action. And her move 3 is definitely very useful in catching opponents to push that aggressive playstyle, especially because she's melee and not ranged, and oftentimes melee fighters have a hard time catching up to their opponents in order to do combats. But the move 3 definitely helps out a whole lot, and her ability, again, is just super unique and it's very strong. So we're going to see some other cards in the deck that play into the ability and the 3rd action and all that, but this is something you're going to have to try out for yourself and see if you like it. A lot of people really like the puzzle of trying to trigger this ability as often as you can, and some people aren't as big of a fan. I kind of compare this to like almost Jekyll and Hyde-esque, because you have incredibly powerful potential, but you don't always get to see that full potential throughout the course of a game because you're a little bit limited because the opponent is able to play around your ability. So they kind of have to play into you in a way, but it's a super strong ability if you're able to get it to trigger. And so the first card we're going to see of Bloody Mary's deck is going to be the bonus attack that she has called Bloody Requiem. And it's a 3 value attack with a 4 boost value, so that's really high for the boost. Definitely helps her reach basically anywhere on the board that she pleases when she is trying to be aggressive there. But the Bloody Requiem, just a blank 3, but then the bonus attack called Bloody Reprise, that says during combat if your opponent played a card against Bloody Requiem, the first part of this attack, then the Bloody Reprise, the attack value becomes the defense card's printed value. So if you attack with a Bloody Requiem into, let's say, a skirmish, which is a 4 value, you don't deal any damage, the skirmish gets to push you away, but bonus attacks still trigger even if you're not currently in range for that second attack. So then, since they played the 4 value skirmish, the Bloody Reprise is going to be a 4 value attack going back at them. And that's incredibly strong. You're getting a 2-for-1 trade in terms of hand advantage there. And a 4 value attack for the bonus is very strong, a 3 into a 4 for 1 card. That's pretty crazy potential. Now, if they choose not to defend against this, then it's a 3, and then you don't get the bonus attack to trigger. Similar to Wukong's, but at least in this case, you still get 3 damage through because they took the first Bloody Requiem attack. So definitely feels better than Wukong there. Also, in the case of a Feint, it's a 3 over a 2, so you at least deal 1 damage still from that first attack. You won't get the Bloody Reprise, but again, you used up a Feint, you dealt the damage. You should be pretty happy about that, in my opinion. And again, there's 3 copies of this in the deck, so it's definitely a big threat of Mary's. And that 4 boost value we're going to see come into play a lot more with some other cards, and even just in practice, you'll see a lot of situations where that 4 boost value definitely helps out a lot. So Bloody Requiem, fantastic card overall, and 3 copies in the deck really helps out Mary. And next up, we're going to see another extremely powerful card in Mary's deck called Broken Glass. So Broken Glass is a 3 value versatile. It says during combat you may increase or decrease the value of this card by 1. So you can either bump it up to a 4 or down to a 2 during combat. And then after combat, if the value of this card matches your opponent's card, draw a card and the opposing fighter takes 2 damage. There's 3 copies of this in the deck, so it's definitely one of her best cards and super versatile. So let's say you attack with this card and they play a skirmish. You bump yours up to a 4, you don't deal any combat damage, and they get to move you with the skirmish, but since you matched the value, you draw a card to make up for this card, and you also deal the 2 auto damage to your opponent over a skirmish, which is one of the best defenses in the game. So that's insanely good. A thing to note with this card is that you have to match your opponent's current card value, not printed card value. So if your opponent's card is like a momentous shift, and they attack and you defend with a Broken Glass, you're not able to match the 5 that the shift ends up being, because you can only bump this up 1 up to a 4 at best. But again, I mean, a 4 value defense card is really good even if it's a blank 4. And that's just in the case that they hit you with a 5, right? If they hit you with a 4, which is also pretty common value, like a disengage or a skirmish, you can change this to a 4 to match it. You win the combat, you don't take any damage, you deal them the 2, and you draw a card. So just super strong there. I mean, if you attack with this into a Feint, you still deal 1 damage over the Feint. I would say the best thing to get around this card is like attacking into a Broken Glass with a regroup, because Broken Glass is not able to get less than a 2, so the regroup is going to waste the Broken Glass and still draw that fighter a card. And Mary, wasted one of her Broken Glasses. But in general, Broken Glass is pretty easy to pull off, and you're just going to have to learn the matchup in particular that you're up against in terms of if it's better to attack or defend with Broken Glass so that you can most often trigger the ability. And it's cool too because let's say your opponent, you attack with Broken Glass into their 2 value defense. Now you could choose to go down to a 2 so that you match the values, deal the 2 damage, and draw your card. Or if, depending on your hand count, if you don't want to draw, you can bump it up to a 4, and you're still going to deal the 2 damage because of 4 over the 2, but then you won't draw your card. So that doesn't put you closer to fatigue, and it also manages your hand count to best suit whatever you're trying to do in terms of trying to get down to 3 cards for your ability. So this card is just incredibly versatile and super powerful in almost every single circumstance. It's probably the best and most reliable card in Mary's whole deck. So for the next card, we're going to see the scheme card here called Closer Than She Appears. And it reads, move Bloody Mary up to 1 space, draw 1 card, gain 1 action. So at first glance, this card does not seem that impactful, right? Because it's like, oh, 1 space is barely any movement. You're just drawing a card, which you could have done anyways with a maneuver and moved 3 instead, right? But then you do gain the action. Now, the reason that's so important is because that means you are able to get to your 3rd action without triggering your ability. And there's 2 copies of this card in the deck, and it's honestly one of the most important cards in her whole deck, because some of the most powerful cards here that we have yet to see involve the 3rd action. So we'll get to those in a minute. But this definitely helps you out in triggering those, even when you're not pulling off your ability. So it's more unexpected for the opponent, because when they see your 3rd action coming due to your ability, they can prepare for it. But with this card, it can happen at any time, even when you have a high hand count. And it's just really strong, and it's surprisingly good. I mean, I didn't think much of this card at first myself, and then in practice, I'm like, wow, this card is actually really, really strong. And even that moving 1 space, it makes you be able to move 4 spaces without having to boost, which is good, because oftentimes people will stay just out of your movement range if they don't want to get hit, so this can close that gap. You can also use this to do something like popping Muldoon's traps and then moving through up to him when he thinks he's safe. It's just really helpful in a lot of different situations that you're going to find yourself in throughout the course of a game. So closer than she appears, it's surprisingly strong. So speaking of the third action cards, we see this card here, Speak 3 times. And it reads, during combat, if this is your third action this turn, the value of this card is 7 instead. That is massive value right there. Now, it's a printed 3 value, so if they feint it, you're only dealing the 1, which is pretty sad, honestly. And it's very telegraphed because you can only bump this to a 7 on your third action specifically. So your opponent is going to tend to hold on to their feints until you use your third action. But that's kind of good for you in a way because it means your bonus attacks are more likely to trigger, your broken glasses are more likely to trigger, and those are really powerful cards in themselves. So the fact that your opponent wants to hold their feints for your third action almost works out just fine for you. And you know what? Sometimes they just don't happen to have the feint when you're doing your third action. And that's where that scheme card comes into play, like I mentioned. So if you do a play and you get your third action naturally through your ability, and you go up and you attack and they feint it, and maybe you threw out a bait, right? Like it wasn't even a Speak 3 times, so they are expecting this card, they throw out their feint, they wasted it because you baited with something else. Now the next turn comes around, and let's say you have 4 cards in your hand because you started at 3, you double maneuvered up to 5, you attack, you're down to 4, they choose not to attack you because they don't want to give you your third action from your ability, and they just used up their feint, so maybe they don't have another one, so they just double maneuver away. Now you're at 4 cards, you maneuver up to 5, you play your scheme, so that keeps you at 5 cards, and now all of a sudden you're in a third action situation and you can smack them here with the 7 when they just used their feint and maybe they don't have another one. So there's definitely ways to pull these cards off, and Speak 3 times is just insanely strong. It's going to be a major source of Mary's damage output. And again, even if it gets feinted, it's not the worst thing in the world because you used one of their feints and you still dealt a damage over it. But this card is just super thematic, it's super powerful, and it feels so good when you get to land this thing. So it definitely makes Mary very fun to play, and this card is just great. And then the next of the third action cards here is going to be Ghostly Touch. Now this is a 1 value attack that reads, during combat you may boost this attack, but after combat, if this is your third action, recover 3 health. Now 3 health is massive healing, and there's 2 copies of this in the deck, so that's upwards of 6 healing, which would effectively make Mary's health total 22. And that's pretty dang good for a solo fighter. Now you're not always going to reach that cap, of course, because this can get feinted, but the potential is there. And honestly, I would rather have this card feinted most often than a Speak 3 times, just for the sole fact that Mary plays an aggressive game, and she probably is looking to end it before the decks run out. So before it gets to fatigue, Mary wants to end the game with damage output. So getting the healing negated is much better most often than getting the damage output negated. And there's also ways to set up Ghostly Touch on, let's say, 1 health sidekicks. The opponent isn't likely to defend one of those guys with a feint, because if you attack with any other bait attack, like any other 3 value or higher, then it kills the 1 health sidekick over the feint and they wasted their feint. So a lot of times they're just going to choose not to defend, even if it's your third action, and that's an easy kill of one of the sidekicks with the Ghostly Touch, and 3 heal pretty reliably. So in certain matchups, this can be more useful than others. Also, it does have that during combat effect of being able to boost it, and remember that Bloody Requiem, the 4 boost value that I mentioned, you can bump this up to a 5, which doesn't come into play super often, but it is hand manipulation if you're trying to get back down to the 3 cards for your ability. And also, if you are attacking the hero with this card, and they play some kind of weak defense because they're expecting the Ghostly Touch, and they just expect you not to boost it, if you surprise them by bumping it up to a 5 over, let's say, a 2 or a 3 value defense that they played, you'd feel pretty good about, getting your 3 heal as well as 2 or 3 damage over their card. Even though it costs you 2 cards to do, it's almost like converting the card you discarded for the boost into an auto damage scheme, which is really strong if you get at least 2 damage with it. So it does come into play sometimes, but obviously the biggest part of this card is that 3 heal for the 3rd action, and it's just another payoff for Mary to get her ability and to use also with her scheme the closer than she appears. So Ghostly Touch, another awesome card. You love to see these types of cards in this deck. And then the last of the 3rd action cards we're going to see is Out of the Mirror. So this is a 1 value attack that reads, during combat, your opponent discards 1 random card, add its boost value to this card's value. So this is basically an ambush, except instead of a 2 value, it's a base of 1, but still almost just as good. And it also says after combat, if this is your 3rd action, you draw 1 card. Now this is definitely the least impactful 3rd action effect that we've seen, but it still comes into play in certain circumstances. So for example, let's say you naturally start your turn with your ability, you get your 3 cards, 3 actions, you maneuver up, you're at 4 cards. You attack, you're down to 3 cards. Now it's your 3rd action, you attack again. Normally that would put you down to 2, which is a dangerous amount of cards to be at, and it also doesn't threaten that follow-up 3rd action on your following turn. So, but in this case, if it's this card, you're attacking down to 2 cards, but this is going to replace itself back up to 3 cards. And it's also going to make your opponent, A, defend 2 attacks that turn, also get a random discard. So you're going to end your turn with yet another 3-card hand, and they might not even have any cards to attack you with. And even if they do have some cards and they want to attack you, their hand size is likely low, so it's a little risky for them. And if you have a card that, like Broken Glass, let's say, that you can defend with that's also going to replace itself, then that's super risky for them to even attack back into you for the counterattack. So there are some situations where Out of the Mirror, that 3rd action draw really helps you out because you're able to manipulate your hand to set up for following turns. But just in general, being an ambush is super impactful. And since your opponent is likely to hold their feints until your 3rd actions, if you use this when it's not your 3rd, you're still going to reliably get that random discard, and that can win you a game in certain matchups. Like say against Dracula, if you hit one of his beast forms, that's a major source of his damage output, he might not be able to close out the game. Or against Invisible Man, you hit maybe one of his schemes like a Step Lightly, or a Vanish, that severely hinders his game plan. So there are situations where this random discard is going to be super beneficial, even outside of using this as your 3rd action. So that makes this card really flexible, and it's quite reliable, even when it's not the 3rd action. So this one is really good, and definitely one of the better cards in Mary's deck. So now we're going to move on to a defense card for Mary called Evade, and it just reads, after combat, draw 1 card. So very simple effect. There's 3 copies of this in the deck, which is really important, because what this card does is when you end your turn with 3 cards in hand, setting up for your 3 actions on your following turn, the opponent is incentivized to then move up and attack you to knock one of your cards out of your hand so that you start with 2 instead of 3. Now, Evade is the risk that the opponent takes when attacking into you, because then they move up, they attack. If you play Evade, you defended the attack and you draw your card to make up for it, so then you still start with 3 cards in hand. They are ending their turn right next to you, going into your 3-action turn, which can be incredibly dangerous depending on what cards Mary has in hand. So Evade is kind of like the glue that holds this deck together. Otherwise it would be too easy for the opponent to play around the 3-card hand. But this card is tricky. Unlike Broken Glass, you know, if the opponent attacks you with a momentous shift into your Broken Glass and you had the 3-card hand, the shift would hit over the Broken Glass and Broken Glass wouldn't match, so it wouldn't draw the card to make up for itself, and then you'd end with 2 cards in hand. But the Evade is the hedge against that. So the opponent doesn't know if you're going to defend with an Evade or a Broken Glass, and so that risk factor is still maybe enough to deter them from even attacking you. But then if they don't attack you, then you just for sure get your 3 actions. So even if they moved away, you get to maneuver twice, which is 6 spaces of movement to catch back up to them, and then still attack them as your 3rd action. So either way, if you end your turn with 3 cards in hand, it's kind of a lose-lose for the opponent if you have this card. And even the threat of this card, even if you don't have it, might be enough to deter them depending on how many cards they have in hand and what the game state looks like. So Evade is an incredibly good card and a very, very important one to just exist in Mary's deck. And next up here we see Infinity Mirror. So this is a 4-value versatile. It says after combat, choose one of the fighters in the combat and move them up to 4 spaces. So this is a really strong card. It's honestly just a leap away, but non-conditional. You don't have to win the combat, you always get the effect, and you get to move one of the fighters up to 4 spaces, just like the leap away does. So there's only 2 copies of this card in the deck, sadly, but it's, again, one of Mary's best cards, and useful in a lot of different situations. You can potentially use this as a 3rd action attack to bait a feint and try to hit 2 damage over the feint. Or you can use this on defense when, let's say you end next to your opponent with 4 cards in hand, they plan to double attack you in order to knock you down from 4 down to 2, and you can play your Infinity Mirror on the first defense, and that's going to move you away or push the opponent away, whichever one you'd like, and then you end with the 3 cards to start your turn going in to get your ability. So Infinity Mirror is just really versatile. There's nothing crazy special about it, but it's just a strong card in general, and definitely one that Mary needs. And next up here is actually one of the most important cards in Mary's deck, I would say, called Jump Scare. Now this is a 3-value versatile that reads during combat, if Bloody Mary shares no zones with the space she started in this turn, this card's value is a 6 instead. So it's a little confusing on the wording with this, but basically when you use this, to get it to be a 6, you have to be in a different zone than the one you started in. So if you start your turn in a tri-zone space, it's going to be really hard to pull off a jump scare. But if you start your turn in a single zone space, you might be able to swing around and hit your opponent from the other side and be in a different zone than you started, which threatens this card being a 6. Now, this is one of the cards they definitely want to feint that's not a 3rd action attack. You can use this anytime, and so the threat of jump scare, you want to put that on your opponent as often as you possibly can. Even if you're not using the jump scare, you want your opponent to have to consider that it might be this card, and that they might want to feint it if they don't have another big defense like a skirmish. Even a skirmish of 4 value, jump scare is going to deal 2 damage over that. So again, this is a major source of Mary's damage output and a crucial card in her deck. So threaten this card as often as possible. Even if you're not using it, try to always think about where can you end your turn so that on your following turn, if you end up wanting to attack your opponent, where can you go to trigger the jump scare or to put that threat out there on your opponent. Because the mind games with this card are huge. This card is incredibly strong. You almost never want to use this as defense unless it's a last resort because it's just a blank 3. Almost in all cases, you could use something like the Infinity Mirror to move into a different zone if you're up against a ranged fighter, but almost always this is a blank 3, and you just really want to save this for an attack to get that 6. So threaten this card as often as you can, and make your opponent fear you. And then we're going to see another defense card from Mary called Mirror Image, and it reads, during combat, the value of this card is equal to the printed value of your opponent's card. Now, it starts as a base of 0, so if they were to attack with something like a feint into this, they can deal the 2 damage over this because the feint immediately would cancel the during combat effect of this card. So it has its weaknesses, but it also has its strengths. If Bigfoot attacks into Mary and you mirror image, this card becomes a 6 and fully blocks his 6. Now, something like a Momentous Shift attacking into a mirror image, its baseline is a 3, so the mirror image is a 3, but the shift is going to bump itself during combat up to a 5, because mirror image cares about printed values. So anything that can increase its value is very good into mirror image, and anything that is just a flat value is bad into mirror image. So it's really a swingy card. It really depends on the matchup that you're playing in terms of how good this card actually is. Against Bigfoot, mirror image is pretty dang good. Against Dracula, if you mirror image a beast form, your mirror image is a 6, and they're probably not even going to want to discard cards to bump over it because it's only 1 damage per card, and the beast form itself didn't deal any additional damage. Against Arthur, you can play mirror image against Excalibur, and it becomes a 6. And the most damage he can deal over this is a 3 if he boosts the Excalibur with a Noble Sacrifice. So It's really matchup dependent on how useful this card is. Some matchups, this card feels like one of the best defenses in the world, and some matchups, this card is just almost completely useless. So it's a good one to use as a boost if you need to in a matchup where it doesn't do much. But then in certain matchups where you know it could potentially be really important, definitely try to hold on to this one. So it really just depends. Again, overall, it's hard to say how good this card is. It's just matchup dependent. So learn the matchup and play this card accordingly. And speaking of cards that are very matchup dependent, we're going to see another scheme called Stolen Memories. Now this card reads, look at an opponent's hand and choose a card. Your opponent may discard it. If they don't, their hero takes damage equal to its boost value. So this card again is really situational. Against, let's say, King Arthur, if you play this card and you see Excalibur in their hand, that's going to be a really tough choice for them because they're either going to have to take 3 damage and you get full hand knowledge from one scheme, or you're going to get to discard their Excalibur, which they really need as their source of damage. Same thing against Dracula with that beast form. So in certain matchups, this card is just crazy good for specific cards. Now, if you happen to play this card at the wrong time and they don't have what you're looking for, it can be pretty mediocre because your opponent getting the choice, they obviously pick what's best for them, which means you're also limited with this card in what you can even choose to make an impact. Because let's say you see your opponent's hand and you want to discard one of their feints, but their feint is only a 1 boost value. That's a pretty easy choice for them. They're just going to keep the feint and take 1 damage, not a big deal. And if you pick a card that has a high boost value, but it's kind of a throwaway card, they're just going to choose to discard it and not take the damage. So you really got to try to find the middle ground where you make the decision tough on your opponent. Like, let's say if the feint is a 2 boost value, which some decks have, then it's kind of a more difficult decision on whether or not they want to discard their feint, which is probably going to save them damage down the road, or if they want to take 2 damage from your scheme. And playing a scheme from anywhere on the board, getting full hand knowledge of your opponent, and dealing 2 damage, that's really, really strong. I mean, it's like a better version of Invisible Man's Reign of Terror, which can hit anywhere on the board, but only if he's on a fog token. So, again, certain situations, Stolen Memories is just crazy strong. Think about Muldoon. If you reveal his Call for Backup, it's a 3 boost value, so he's either going to take 3 damage, which is really a big hit to Muldoon, or he's going to discard Call for Backup, which is literally his best card in the deck, especially in this matchup. In most matchups, I would say. So, again, Stolen Memories, very matchup dependent. You got to know what you're looking for, and you got to be patient with this card because sometimes if you just fire it off too soon, your opponent's not going to have that card you're looking for. You got to give it some time for them to draw into it, but try to pull this off before they're actually able to use that card. So it really takes a lot of matchup knowledge to use to its maximum efficiency. But it's a really cool card in general. Being able to use it as a pass is helpful because it is Mary's only pass in the deck. There's 2 copies of this. The 3 boost value can also be used as a useful boost to close the gap if you're trying to be aggressive. And just being able to play this and not draw a card to manipulate your hand for following turns is also beneficial. So it's got a lot of uses. You're just going to have to find what works best for you in the situation. And next up, we're going to see Trick of the Light. So this card is only a 2 value, and it reads, after combat, you may place Bloody Mary in an empty space adjacent to the opposing fighter. There's 3 copies of this in the deck, and honestly, this is kind of one of her biggest throwaway cards, which is fine because it does have a 3 boost value, so that really comes in handy when you're trying to push that aggression. And you don't feel so bad discarding this to boost like you would some of the other cards like the Stolen Memories we just talked about or something else. So, again, I mean, this card is a little bit weak. You don't really want to use it on defense because you're likely to take a lot of damage, and it doesn't even get you away. So if you're trying to avoid a double attack, this card won't help you out with that. You can, however, use this as, let's say, a second action attack, because if you get your 3 actions, you move up as your first action, you attack them, they might be thinking, okay, if I defend with something like a leap away, and I win the combat, and I push him back, or her, I should say, because it's Bloody Mary, but that will prevent the 3rd action attack because you're no longer adjacent. So a card attacking with Trick of the Light, the leap away would go first, the Trick of the Light would then trigger and bring you back adjacent to the opponent for you to get your 3rd action attack off. when otherwise it would have been avoided. So there's definitely some tricky plays you can do with this card, hence the name Trick of the Light. It's very fitting, and it really just depends on the situation. Also, this card is great against ranged because it lets you get right up to them so that you can be aggressive, especially against somebody like Muldoon, who hides behind workers and traps, or Robin Hood hides behind his outlaws, or Medusa behind her harpies. It gets you past the defense line and right up into the face of the opponent, so you're ready to attack them and take advantage of your 3 actions that you're hopefully getting. So there are some situations where you want to use this on defense, again mainly against range, and you can use it as a good bait attack on offense. So there's some uses, but in general, don't be afraid to use it to boost. It's one of your best cards to use in order to do so. So although this isn't the strongest card in the deck, I definitely like having it be there. And last but not least, guys, we have Feint. Now, interestingly enough, there's only 2 copies of Feint in Mary's deck, which is a little weird because she's all about 3s, right? And in every other deck that we've seen Feint in, there's 3 copies in the deck. So it is really weird to see only 2. I don't know if it's an issue to do with the balance of her deck or just not enough deck space to fit in all the cool cards that she has, so they cut it down from 3 to 2. But in any case, it's better to have 2 than to have 0, right? Sun Wukong, we didn't see any Feints. So Mary at least has 2. Now that is going to be a hindrance against certain matchups like Sinbad, where you need to negate those late game voyages, or maybe against Little Red, where you really need to negate some of her auto damage or her discard effects. But in general, if you're pushing the aggression, your opponent isn't going to be counterattacking you as much, at least that's the hope, because they're not going to feel safe enough to do so. And so with you not getting attacked as often, you're not going to feel the need to feint as often. So the 2 copies of the card in the deck might not make as big of a difference as you would think. And Feint is a good card. At least we get to see it in some capacity in Mary's deck. And there you have it, guys. That's going to do it for Bloody Mary. And like I mentioned, she's really an aggressive fighter, which is super fun, and it's a very interesting puzzle trying to get that ability to trigger as often as you can. And sometimes you have to make some pretty brave plays with like taking an undefended attack when you have 3 cards in hand, just so that you're able to trigger your ability on your following turn. And that means taking some damage in the process, but if you're able to dish out more damage than you're taking, you're staying ahead, in the race that Bloody Mary likes to play, because again, she's not a fatigue fighter. She just wants to push that aggression, keep the hand advantage with her extra actions, and her mobility, being able to maneuver like 6 spaces and then get an attack, is huge for closing the gap as well as the hand count. And so just push the aggression, make them play your game, make them scared of you like they should be because you're Bloody Mary, and you should have a great time playing this deck. It's a ton of fun and super unique, and it's really cool to see these thematic fighters like this and something so obscure such as Bloody Mary. And the whole Battle of Legends Volume 2 roster really is incredible. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that set releasing, and thankfully it's not too much longer. And in the meantime, guys, if you want to see me playing these new fighters live on Twitch, I have been streaming a lot of Battle of Legends 2 practice streams. And so just head over to twitch.tv/ZeroSkater12 to check out some of the new fighters in action. And it's just a blast, and I've just gotten a lot of community members online for those streams to play against. And it's just a fun time in general, both playing the new fighters, getting to watch them, and just hanging out with everyone in the community. So definitely go check out my Twitch channel if you'd like to be a part of that. Again, guys, I am going to be doing some deck reviews for the other 2 fighters, being Achilles and Yananga still. So look forward to those in the coming weeks. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. And if you did, be sure to give it a like, comment down below, let me know what you thought. And be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I would really appreciate that. And if you want to keep seeing more awesome content like this, then you definitely want to hear about it when it's released. So that's going to do it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. I'm ZeroSkater12, and I'll see you next time.